Look, broadly, here is yet another defining moment for the regional security in the Indo-Pacific region, and particularly for the mil-to-mil ties between Washington and Beijing. We are at the IISS Shangri-La Security Dialogue, the annual global security conference in Singapore. This year, the Defense Minister of China and the U.S. Acting Secretary of Defense, Mr. Patrick Shanahan, are sharing the stage together, addressing the most pressing issues in Southeast Asia and globally. How will China and the U.S. coexist in this region? How are ASEAN nations influenced by the heating up China-U.S. tensions? And where is the path to a brighter and safer future? To look for answers, I'm happy to talk with Professor Wang Gungwu, a highly respected historian from the National University of Singapore. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to our show. So honored each time when I come to cover the Shangri-La Security Dialogue in your country here. Now, since 8 years ago, China has not sent any senior delegation. This time around, Minister of Defense Wei Fenghe headed the Chinese delegation, and that's of course a big event for the organizers, the IISS. Will that make a difference from the perspective of the Singaporeans and ASEAN?
I think it does make a difference. I think everyone noticed how rarely the Chinese send anyone senior to the Shangri-La Dialogue. This has been going on, after all, for nearly 20 years. So whenever China does, people take notice. I think at the beginning there were some misunderstandings about what IISS stands for. But I think people are beginning to realize that it is a forum, a chance and opportunity for people to really get to know each other and share some views. However much they may disagree, at least there's a chance for them to let each other know in front of everybody what their views are. And that exchange of views would enable people to have a better understanding of what the relationships between the various countries, not only China and the United States, but China's absence at a senior level for many years caused a kind of imbalance in the situation, which would have been a bit misleading to lots of people, giving the impression that either the Chinese did not take it seriously or boycotted it, which is not true, but at least in my view, in my understanding, or the other countries are using the Shangri-La Dialogue for their interests, and China is missing out on the opportunities to make their own points clear.
What about, say, the key issues on the agenda between the two secretaries of defense? Mr. Shanahan, Acting Secretary of Defense, who heads the U.S. delegation, came over. So would he set the tone for the bilateral mil-to-mil tie? And what are the major issues, do you think?
I think he would certainly try to do that. I think every time the senior member from the United States comes to Shangri-La, they will use the opportunity to try and set the tone. But that doesn't always work, because it depends on what the message is, and there's always an opportunity to rebut, to answer. So sometimes having a second chance or to speak afterwards offers you an opportunity to counter whatever arguments we've made. So I wouldn't say that makes that much of a difference. You can't actually set the tone for the whole thing, because don't forget, you are all very senior. They are all both very senior members of the government. Whatever they say would matter whether one says it first or the other says it second. Personally, I don't think it makes much of a difference.
Let's look at the issue from a cultural perspective. You understand the Chinese history and Chinese culture very well. Let's look at how people from different parts of the world would respond to this situation. Now, you are always bashed in a crusade against China. So there are basically two different attitudes. One is to take the punch proactively and say loudly, look, you are wrong. Or there's another entirely different attitude. You withdraw from the center stage. You would rather observe and watch and try to figure out what would be done to take the punch and give a second strike. So from the perspective of Taiji, Taiji boxing is very different from American boxing in the arena. So what do you think of the way of thinking and the pattern of behavior on the Chinese side?
I think in most of the countries of the world probably assume that the modern approach is more direct and sometimes confrontational, other times at least reasonable opposition or reasonable debate is the best way to make progress. I think that has become a more modern understanding of how countries should behave to each other. The idea that Chinese Taiji or other means of dealing with a tricky situation is more subtle, and it's harder to convey that to ordinary people. So if you look at how other ordinary people would look at a particular situation, they tend to like it when people stand up and confront each other and talk it out or debate it. I think people enjoy a debate, a fight, so to speak, in the open. That's easier to understand.
What do you think of the importance of Taiwan? Because the level of dialogue, for the security departments on both sides, Taipei and Washington, has been upgraded to the surprise of the Chinese observers, because that means the U.S. is getting very close to the red line that the generations of the Communist Party leadership drew since Deng Xiaoping.
I think the world actually got a glimpse of that when President Trump made a phone call to Tsai Ing-wen. We were very surprised. I think the whole world was surprised, but the call was made, and Tsai Ing-wen actually responded. I think she also was surprised. So I think that gave an indication. I suppose we didn't take it that seriously for a while because it was dropped, but I think it's an indication that the new regime in Washington, D.C. are prepared to try new ways of opening dialogues or putting out feelers, and that they're not just going to follow conventional diplomatic and the usual methods of conversation, that they would like to be able to dictate the conversation in a different way. At least that, looking back, I would say that was a small indication, very gently put, but and then pulled back. Nevertheless, it was an indication that this government in Washington is not the same, and their style will be different. And I think it has proven to be correct. I mean, President Trump is a very, very different kind of president from President Obama.
The Chinese top legislature has adopted the anti-secession law, whilst in 1979, when the relationship was normalized between Washington and Beijing, the U.S. Congress passed the Taiwan Relations Act. So the change in their Taiwan policy in the D.C. might trigger a sharp rise in tensions and may cause accidental shots. So what do you think of the ability on both sides to manage a crisis?
Well, as I recall it, when the Congress passed the Taiwan Relations Act, it was in the middle of the Cold War. The circumstances were very different. And what should follow from that is not, as it were, straightforward. Once the Cold War was ended, with the United States triumphant at the end of that, then the Taiwan Relations Act serves as a different purpose. The fact that it is there is not in the context of the Cold War. Whether or not they bring it up or highlight it depends on circumstances. I think it's not a direct continuation. In other words, I don't think it just follows logically and chronologically. It has to be followed right to the end. That was a decision made at a time when China's relations with the United States were very bad. I mean, they were not that good either. They were just the beginning of a dialogue. So I would say that the present position comes from a very different set of circumstances. It is the beginning of some kind of new kind of Cold War, which has probably began 10, 15 years ago, but implemented differently. And when President Trump came, he took it up and decided to play it open, but in his own way, using his own particular negotiating methods that he had perfected in his own career. And this, I think, has taken the whole world by surprise. I think I imagine the Chinese were not entirely prepared for that, but the rest of us were also surprised how quickly he used some of his methods which are not in the normal diplomatic textbook, nor in the normal practice, and he has managed to get that into conversations which put him and everybody else on the edge of their seats without knowing precisely what he has in mind. And that way may or may not succeed. I have no idea. I mean, he's obviously very good at it, and he understands it, and he's quite cool about it. But what I think is clear is that ordinary diplomatic practices that we have been accustomed to doesn't work here. And you have to, in a way, think separately, differently, how to respond to somebody who uses such very unusual methods to deal at the international level.
We understand heavyweight policymakers on both sides across the aisle, Democrats and Republicans, want to redefine the relationship, the most consequential bilateral one in the world from their perspective. There was a strong voice that suggests clearly, particularly were it not for the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the Bush administration would have changed their course, would have adopted a much more hawkish China policy. Do you agree?
I agree. I think that was already on the cards, but as everyone would have noted at the time, the 9/11 attack on New York caused a diversion. Mm-hmm. And the United States was distracted from that particular thought for a while. But I would have thought that by that time, the American leadership was already divided as to what to do about China. But they had one clear understanding, that China was not responding to their plans for China the way they had hoped. I think the Americans, after the Cold War, when they defeated the Soviet Union, so to speak, and the Soviet Communist Party had collapsed, they probably had expectations that it was possible to engineer something similar in China in a peaceful way, in using peaceful methods, that by getting China more engaged in the world, completely dedicated or committed to the free market economy, and that the economic development would create a new middle class, which would then ultimately pressure the Chinese Communist Party to move towards more and more liberal, in the Americanized, comparatively liberal approaches, which the Americans would prefer to have. I think there was a group of people who argued of that possibility. No need to confront, but use peaceful methods to ensure that China changes from within, and that when China does that, it will be in America's interest, because China would then follow the American way in a whole range of ways. I think that was the group that was ascendant. But there was always a group that was skeptical about that. It's not only in the Pentagon, but in the State Department and elsewhere, even among some of the business circles who felt that probably might not work, because I think they thought it was too optimistic to think that the Chinese society could change into a kind of liberal American human rights democratic society so quickly. So there were people who were skeptical. But that group, I think, was probably evenly balanced at the time of the Clinton-Bush transition. But since that time, partly because of the economic problems that the Americans faced in the first decade of the century, and partly because the Chinese moved so much faster than anybody expected, and particularly when Chinese spent more and more money on defense. I mean, the investment in the Navy, for example, rose quite spectacularly in the eyes of most people from the 1990s onwards. And when they saw that this was not a small change, but would be a systematic strengthening of the naval forces of China, I think there were people who started to pay attention and take notice, and felt that if this goes on, then one day the kind of military supremacy that the Americans have enjoyed will be lost. And the sooner you slow that down, the better for America, if you can. And I think that argument was already being made. But they were still a minority. The majority still felt the kind of argument that tried to make China into a stakeholder in the whole international system.
Such as the voice of Rupert Dolly.
And he represented a very strong view that this was a better way to get, since China was already embarked on, after entry into WTO, the way it was changing, the chances of China joining and becoming more like America and with the same interest in certain things succeeding, that it gets similar, become more and more like America's viewpoint, then that would be better, that to bring China in and maybe get China to accept being some kind of junior partner to America's effort to change the world. It was probably not a bad idea at the time, but you recall how China quickly said no. They didn't want to be G2. That was one of the phrases used. And I think China was very wise, because I think China could not have become a junior partner to a U.S. enterprise. That was just not on the cards. But that you can see a large group of people who felt there was still some chance of pushing that. But there was a group of people who didn't think it was, who were very skeptical of it. And these people continued to believe what they believed in, and they have grown larger because the economic success of China has actually made a fantastic difference. The economic position of China today, when people start saying China is now number 2, and in so many years China will be number 1 economically, all that, of course, raises big questions within the United States for the middle class in America, who have not been doing all that well in terms of their general standard of living. It's been pretty stagnant. I mean, they're comfortable, but it's stagnant. And the way globalization has occurred, and we talked about globalization before, which is happening very fast in every corner of the world, the inequalities produced by globalization is becoming more and more obvious. Every country feels a little bit less equal because globalization has enabled the rich to do very well and the middle class to actually be stagnant. The poor might actually get a little bit better off, but the middle class, and they are larger and larger, and very large in the United States, growing in Asia, that middle class in the United States and Europe particularly feel that they are not benefiting as much as they thought they might. All this, I think, added to the final feeling that they can't go on like that, and if proceeding at that rate, the United States will one day be unable to stop China.
Thank you very much for being with us. You are watching our dialogue with Professor Wang Gungwu, a senior expert of power politics and regional studies, particularly diplomacy of China. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us, please. Come back. Let's look at the policy responses from our neighboring countries like Japan, South Korea. They are allies of the United States. And obviously, because of the American unilateral withdrawal from TPP, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was not very happy. So they have developed a feeling of uncertainty along with the Europeans about the presidency of Donald Trump. So they got to keep a balance. They got to invest in both sides, Washington and Beijing. So what do you think of the efforts by Shinzo Abe to be more friendly and more constructive in sustaining the policy of engagement with Beijing?
I suspect that the Prime Minister of Japan is in a difficult position at the moment because he wants Japan to be more upfront in many of the world's affairs. But the constitution of Japan that was imposed on them in 1945 prevents Japan from being more active. So he wants to change that. But the people of Japan don't really want that. They're quite happy with the present situation. So his feeling is that Japan, if it remains in that position, will be less and less powerful, or less and less able to have a voice, strong voice, with the rise of China. I think that is quite obvious. At the same time, the idea that Japan would always be dependent on the United States to defend it against any other powers in Asia is something the Japanese pride cannot accept, not as something that will be forever. So sooner or later, they will have to be independent, really, and not depend on the United States. They cannot really rely on the United States anyway. They don't genuinely believe that that is possible. So that is the kind of difficult position that Japan is in. And they have been in that position for quite some time. So they want to get out of that position, on the one hand, by being extra friendly to the United States, but at the same time, getting closer to China in other ways, because they recognize that in Asia, they cannot hope to outbid China in the long run. So in the long run, to be a partner of China will be in Japan's interest. So how to balance that, I think, is in his mind. So my feeling is that right now his number one hope is to get the United States to rejoin the Trans-Pacific Agreement. I think they have revived it. Now almost everybody else who joined it in the first place have joined it, except the United States.
Excuse me, Professor Wang, let's put aside the issue of TPP for a while. Let's look at the issue of Taiwan. As I said earlier, the level of security cooperation between Taipei and Washington has alarmed Beijing. And do you think the next election in Taiwan would help change the adverse relationship across the Taiwan Strait? For example, were the blue camp, the KMT, able to take the leadership in Taiwan through the use of ballot box? Will that help avert head-on collision?
I think everybody is now much more confused about the politics of Taiwan than before. It is no longer a straightforward blue versus green. There are so many middle groups now operating, and I feel that that is actually a good sign. It shows that the Taiwanese people are not just plain, narrowly Taiwanese in the kind of way that they used to be under Chen Shui-bian, but now they're at a point where they are thinking of their own long-term interests as Taiwanese, who are also Chinese, and this is a subject they cannot avoid, and that they would not want a situation to be either or. They would like a situation whereby they could survive. Whether that can happen or not is very difficult to say, but I think that's what they want. And they don't want to throw down the gauntlet and have a solution. The solution will be very bad for everybody, and I think they are aware of it. And all the intelligent arguments that have been presented in Taiwan that I have seen suggest that they clearly don't want to be leaning one side or the other. They would like to find somewhere in between. So if the Americans are pulling them in, I think they would like to see this as something that will increase their bargaining power with Beijing, if Beijing can respond. So maybe this is something of a process rather than an end.
We are running out of time. We are signing off. But before we conclude this discussion, very quickly, Professor Wang, are you convinced personally that the U.S.-Japan Security Pact would be the cornerstone for ensuring regional security in Northeast Asia, with Taiwan being included? What does that mean? Very quickly.
I personally don't know whether the Americans will actually go very far towards that. But what they want to do, make quite sure, is that their current position in Asia, including the South China Sea, but in the Indo-Pacific generally, will not decline. They want to maintain this as the minimum position is to be status quo. They don't use the word so often now. They used to use it. But now, because they recognize they are also a revisionist power. But at least in their minds, the position they don't want to lose is their present position. So if they can use a position now to stop China from gaining on them and reducing and diminishing their position in the Indo-Pacific, they would probably be willing to accept that. But if there's a question of the Chinese pushing them out or edging them out over time in the long run, I think they would find that, at this point anyway, unacceptable.
Thank you very much for being with us. I really appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome.